Previously on the Find Jodi podcast. Jodi's apartment complex in Mason City has 3 buildings. Jodi lived in Building C.
This car comes racing out of there, and she says, like, somebody was really mad and in a big hurry. She described the vehicle. She wasn't really quite sure the color. She had one point said blue, and then maybe went to red. She said it wasn't a small, it was like more of a mid-size or so car.
It took 5 days for police to even classify Jodi's case as an abduction publicly. And that's when they also revealed their interest in a mid-'80s model white Ford van. Police had become aware of the van after a tip was called in by Randy Linderman, a man who lived on the same street as Jodi's complex and drove by it every day on his commute.
Kind of loops around if you go in the parking lot there. Right before you come out, it was parked right there with the parking lights on, waiting for somebody to come out or something.
I could look out and see like the apartment complex, but I remember 4:30 hearing like a car door, and I rolled over. I saw what looked to be like a white or a light gray van on the street, not in the parking lot, but in the street. As I was sort of falling back asleep, heard another door close, and when I woke up 2 hours later, I guess, the van was gone.
It was merely 12 steps from her apartment door to her car door. We're talking seconds, and she would have been in the safety of her own car. It wasn't a stranger that just drove by and seen her walking through the parking lot. But, I can't rule that out either.
Before sunrise, on a mild summer morning, in June 1995, a 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, 2 television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official Find Jodi podcast. Welcome back to the Find Jodi podcast. I'm Scott Fuller. For this episode, you're going to have an understanding of the layout of the Key apartment complex, where Jodi Huisentruit was abducted in the early morning hours of June 27, 1995. Jodi was a television news anchor, and she was late for work that morning, Tuesday morning. She was apparently abducted from the parking lot of her apartment complex. But this complex has 2 parking lots and 3 buildings. The Key Apartments in Mason City, the complex, back then, just like now, has 3 buildings, Building A, Building B, and Building C. Jodi lived on the top floor of Building C. Her unit faced one of 2 parking lots available to the residents there, and Jodi's window would have looked out over the parking lot that she used. So from inside her apartment, Jodi could see her parking lot and the other 2 buildings of the apartment complex to the north. The second parking lot in the complex is to the north of those 2 buildings. So if you like, imagine a football goalpost. Jodi's building, Building C, is the horizontal crossbar at the bottom, and Buildings A and B are the uprights, extending vertically away from Building C. In 1995, there were about 80 residents of the complex, most of whom lived in the larger Buildings A and B. Jodi's Building C was the smallest of the 3. It had about 12 units, maybe 14, 15 people living there. So that is how I've generally described the layout of the Key Apartments. But again, the layout of the complex is very important to understand while you listen to this episode, so have a listen to how Find Jodi co-founder Josh Benson described the area in our last Q&A.
Where it happened, we paced it off from the door she would come out of to her car, and it wasn't that many paces, probably 10 to 12, maybe 15 paces from the door. So when you drive in there, it's kind of a horseshoe shape. You drive in on the right side and you drive around to the left, and then you exit the same way you came in. She was on the kind of the final turn down on the far side on the left side. So that's where the entrance to the one building on the left would be. And she came out of that door, and her Mazda Miata was there, and kind of in between the vehicles out into the parking lot is where it happened. All of the apartments have a view, especially the building on the left, have a view of that that area.
Yeah.
But it's past 4 a.m, so it's, unless you're sound asleep, unless you're up and you're not sleeping, either you hear something, or if you happen to look out the window, I mean, I think you'd see a car pull out of there, or a truck or a van. It's not like it's hidden away from sight.
The entire apartment complex borders a campground that's used throughout the summer. The campground is directly to the west, right up against the complex. Like any other campground, campers can pitch a tent or park an RV for a night or a week or longer. And the residents of the Key Apartments consisted probably of your average cross-section of any other apartment complex, then or now. A mix of single people, married couples, some college-aged, some retired, some students, some professionals. The complex also listed 2 corporate leases in 1995, one that was taken out by a local business. Another unit was rented by a corporation that was contracted to do some environmental compliance work with the city and the county at the time. In tracking down as many of the people as we can who live there in 95 or before or after, what do you think is the overall feel of the cross-section of people that lived there that we've gathered? FindJodi team member Caroline Lowe.
I would say it's a real mix, primarily single people. I came across very few references to any children, but young professionals, some college students, retirees, at one point some police officers, a couple of the apartments were corporate rentals, so kind of a mix of, I'd say, mostly professionals.
The manager of the Key Apartments in 1995 was a woman named Rose Tobin. I recently sat down and met with Rose, who is now in her 80s.
This has bothered me all these years. I still go to bed half the time saying prayers and thinking about her.
Rose acknowledges all these years later she can't remember everything about what happened on that day that Jodi disappeared. But over the years, she has offered quite a few details publicly about that morning that Jodi disappeared and the time before. Rose has previously stated that she heard a vehicle revving its engine in the parking lot on that morning that Jodi was taken. When she looked out her window, she said, Rose saw a 2-tone, dark-colored car that was headed out of the parking lot turning south. Rose, today, no longer recalls this. But while Rose Tobin may now not remember a vehicle revving its engine that morning, she does still remember a car. Whether Rose is remembering now that same car that she talked about previously, or a different car, it is worth our attention, though, because it may be corroborated by another witness. A witness whose account has never been made public until now. This witness was a resident of Building B, who was recently interviewed by FindJodi's Caroline Lowe. The witness is choosing to remain anonymous. She says when she returned home to her apartment after working an 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. overnight shift into June 27, 1995, she encountered a lone police officer in the parking lot right next to Building C. This detail would seem to check out. Police were dispatched to Jodi's parking lot at 7:13 a.m. So it seems likely this witness would have encountered the first police officer on the scene of Jodi's abduction, right about just when the officer arrived. The witness says the officer asked her if she knew who owned that red car, referring to Jodi's car, and where the owner of that car lived, which unit she lived in, referring to Jodi. The witness says she thought it was a strange question. But it wasn't until much later that morning that she learned about Jodi's disappearance. And this is where the witness's memories from days and weeks before the disappearance crosses paths with Rose Tobin's memory today. This witness, the resident of Building B, told Caroline Lowe that she had complained to Rose Tobin twice about a creepy guy, as she put it, who apparently lived in the campground behind the Key apartment complex. Here's Caroline.
As you know, Scott, we hear from people from a lot of different directions, and in this particular case, the woman reached out to us on Facebook. The thing that really stays with her is she said, I reported a creepy guy that was living in the campground next to the Key apartment. I reported him to the landlord twice. The day that Jodi went missing, the car that I reported vanished. So when people keep talking about a white van, I kept saying no, it had to be that creepy guy in the campground.
The witness says she saw this man inside a gray car parked behind Building B in the 7 days before Jodi went missing. After Jodi was abducted, the witness says she never saw the man or his gray car again. Perhaps notably, the one thing Rose Tobin says she remembers with clarity now, 26 years later and into her 80s, is a similar dark-colored car. Except Rose says it was a shade of green.
I've read that you didn't hear anything that morning, any screaming or anything like that? You don't remember that?
No.
Do you remember seeing any vehicles that morning?
No, the only thing I saw was up by my building, way up on the corner, the first car up there in the parking lot. That car was a different car. And now there's scads of them. They're a little bit smaller, and it was green.
It was green.
Mm-hmm. And I just remember because I thought when I, come in, whose car is that?
Right.
I knew everybody.
Did you live in B?
I lived in A.
In A, so you lived over here. So you saw the car right here. The green, smaller car?
Yeah, I didn't set it there. I don't know whose it was.
You saw it there. Okay.
Yeah, and it was the first one by this street.
Okay. Do you remember her complaining to you about a sedan that belonged to, I guess, a man who was living in the campground? Do you remember her telling you about that? She said that she had told you twice about that car.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't remember what I did about it or anything.
Okay. You don't remember ever seeing the car or anything like that?
Well, it was later gone.
It was gone later.
I mean, it wasn't parked there anymore.
Okay, is that car the same one that you were just talking about?
Yeah.
During our conversation, Rose was looking around the room that we were sitting in, trying to find something green that she could compare the color of the car that she remembers seeing too. And Rose was wearing an olive green scarf. So I offered, was it something like the scarf you're wearing? Rose said it was a limey green. I said it was more olive green.
Yeah, about limey.
Okay. Olive, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we go too far with this new car, we should point a few things out. First off, the two witnesses to this car or this sedan, the anonymous Building B resident that Caroline Lowe talked to, and Rose Tobin, differ on the vehicle's color, obviously. The witness calls it gray, Rose calls it some shade of green. But the descriptors of, say, an olive green to gray aren't that far off. As for what type or model the vehicle was, here too things are ambiguous. Rose now describes the car as something you commonly see more now than you did back then. The tipster called it more boxy in shape. But there is some inherent credibility, too, in both witness accounts, even if the specifics don't match up perfectly 2.5 decades later. For one thing, the witness was bothered enough by this man and or his vehicle to complain about it then and to remember complaining about it 26 years later. Perhaps even more notably, Rose Tobin seems to have taken some pride in noting which vehicles each of her tenants, each of her residents drove on a regular basis. She became familiar with which vehicles more or less belonged in her complex, and that green car did not belong.
All I know is that green car was a different car than I had had in my parking lot, and it didn't appear again the night or night after, whatever. I'm convinced that whoever had that green car was involved in it somewhere.
This possible vehicle, we should make clear, was not seen by either Rose Tobin or that witness in Jodi's parking lot. It was seen in the other parking lot, the lot that was used by residents of Building A and B. Given this vehicle sighting, the FindJodi team started to wonder if that car and that man might have something to do with the beer cans that multiple witnesses have reported seeing in the parking areas around the same time. It's important to go back quickly and distinguish here that there have been different reports pertaining to beer cans in Jodi's case. It has been said that beer cans were present in Jodi's kitchen sink when police entered the apartment that morning. Here, Rose Tobin, who would have been the first person into the apartment along with the police who she let in, has never confirmed the presence of beer cans in Jodi's sink. In fact, she says the opposite. Rose has previously described the apartment as being immaculate, including a lack of beer cans or anything else in the sink or kitchen area, and Jodi's bed having been somewhat made that morning, or at least the sheets and the comforter pulled up to the pillows. And this still is how Rose says the condition of Jodi's apartment was back then, today.
And there was not a thing out of place. There wasn't a dirty cup, there was nothing out of place. It was just immaculate.
But the beer cans that multiple witnesses who've contacted FindJodi over the years, the beer cans they're talking about are not the alleged beer cans in Jodi's sink. Rather, these beer cans were seen by residents outside in the parking areas. And that same witness who told FindJodi's Caroline Lowe about the so-called creepy guy in his car, she also said she remembered seeing beer cans in the north parking lot.
So we followed up with her and asked her some different kind of things she remembered about being in the complex at the time. And one of the things that stood out is she remembered seeing beer cans in the parking lot behind her building. Now, her building was Building B, which is the one that's adjacent to the campgrounds. And she said there was loud music and those beer cans that she reported to her landlord.
And this is where things might get even more confusing because of another witness, a totally separate resident of the apartment complex, who has also come forward to FindJodi, who also wishes to remain anonymous. This different witness, this different resident, also remembers seeing a row of 4 to 6 beer cans lined up on the curb in the parking lot over the months leading up to Jodi's abduction. But after, she never saw the cans again. Except that second witness remembers seeing the beer cans in Jodi's parking lot. This witness, who was a college student in 1995, agreed to provide a written account to FindJodi of what she remembered seeing. Here is the portion of the witness statement pertaining to the beer cans that she says she saw. These are the witness's words, verbatim, but this is not her voice.
A person or people would sit in the parking lot during the evening and drink beer. The car would face Jodi's apartment building. The person would leave their empty beer cans in the parking lot lined up perfectly on the curb. I believe there were usually 4 cans, however, it's been many years. The reason that this sticks out is because the dumpsters were only about 50 to 100 feet away. There were also garbage cans also about 50 feet away. I would always comment to others in the parking lot and complex that you'd think they could just throw these away. I also observed that once Jodi went missing, so did the beer cans. I never saw them on the curb again.
Once again, this witness is describing beer cans and a vehicle in Jodi's parking lot near Building C. The first witness that Caroline spoke to saw the beer cans possibly associated with that other vehicle that was unknown to her and Rose Tobin in the other parking lot. So, we have multiple witnesses, including the apartment manager, Rose Tobin, 2 report seeing a darker car, a man, and beer cans in the north parking lot, while a third witness also reports seeing a vehicle and beer cans in the other parking lot, the south lot, the lot where Jodi was abducted. But that last witness that you heard from, the college student, had a lot more to tell us. That's coming up next. Now, multiple witnesses, including the manager of the key apartments where Jodi Huisentruit was abducted in 1995, have told FindJodi that a mysterious dark-colored car and several beer cans and a man had been present in both parking lots of that complex in the days and weeks leading up to Jodi's disappearance. After Jodi was taken, the cans and the car and the man seemed to vanish, according to the witnesses. We should also note that we've heard about beer cans in the parking areas from other witnesses who don't need to be mentioned in this episode except to state that they have corroborated these sightings that you've heard. But this most recent witness, whose account you heard before the break, is relevant because she had even more to say. This witness is also a possible van witness. Previously on this podcast, you've heard from two other people who claim to have seen a white or light-colored van in or around the parking lot where Jodi was abducted. A man named Randy Linderman has claimed consistently since the day of the crime that he saw a white Ford Econoline van parked near Jodi's car with its running lights on around the time of the abduction. His tip to the police about the van provided an eternal narrative that a van was involved in Jodi's case. Police acted early on that tip in 1995, but have never located the van, at least as far as we know. Years later, I was able to locate an additional van witness in a woman who was living on the top floor of a house across the street from the apartment complex. She too reported seeing a light-colored van, as well as hearing doors opening and closing when she was trying to sleep. But her account of the van places it on the street, Kentucky Avenue, not in the parking lot where Randy Linderman reported seeing it. Both of those accounts appear in previous episodes of the podcast. As we discussed in those episodes, both sightings could be considered credible. It is possible that both are accurate. Had the van first been parked on the street and perhaps moved into position when Jodi's apartment lights turned on that morning. But this third van sighting, the college student who saw the beer cans in Jodi's parking lot, might be the most compelling of the three. Again, from the written statement provided by this witness to FindJodi about what she says she saw and heard at the Key Apartments sometime in the early morning of June 27, 1995.
What seemed like the middle of the night, I was awoken by a very loud noise. I grew up living next to a railroad and a corn dryer plant, so I typically can sleep through loud noises. I got out of bed and went into the hallway. Several other people opened their doors and either looked out or walked out into the hallway. I proceeded to walk to the end of the hallway where a few other people were gathering. We were gathered on the third-floor hallway that overlooked the parking lot. We looked out into the parking lot. It was very dark, and the only thing you could see was a parked vehicle with its lights still on. I believe the vehicle was a larger light-colored van. We all talked for a few minutes. I eventually walked back to my apartment and went back to sleep.
This witness tells FindJodi that she was interviewed by police and or the FBI in the following days, and claims to have disclosed the information about the beer cans and the van to them. Caroline Lowe once again.
Now then the next morning, she said she came out to go to class, and when she came outside, she could see 5 to 6 police officers' cars there. They were on either side of my car. I was concerned, thinking that someone had run into my car and done some sort of damage to my car. As I walked outside, an officer quickly approached me and started to ask questions. I was still focused on what happened to my car. I quickly discovered that my car was fine. As I walked farther out in the parking lot, I knew something had happened to Jodi. Her belongings were scattered all over the parking lot. They started at the door of her car, went between the cars, and then back out towards where the vehicle with the lights on was parked early that morning. The officer asked me a few questions and then instructed me to notify an officer regarding my whereabouts for the next several days. I went to class, apologized for being late.
So what are your impressions of that witness and what she says she remembers seeing at some point during the night before Jodi was abducted?
I think what strikes me is something got people's attention enough to get out of bed and go look at the parking lot. These were not screams, they were some kind of a noise, because later we heard the police interviewed people who recalled screams. She did not remember that per se, but she remembers some kind of noise that got her and other tenants to go look outside. Remember seeing a vehicle with the lights on in the parking lot. What else sticks out with me is we've never heard anything about a van other than the van that police told us about with Randy Linderman had, the white Econoline van. So we don't know exactly if the van that she saw was there earlier in the evening, just what time in the middle of the night, or is it relevant or not? But that's what drew her attention when she looked out in the middle of the night, just hours before Jodi disappeared.
I think it's notable, too, that in this apartment complex where you have noise probably on a regular basis, you have the campground right next door, something made a noise that night that was unusual enough for multiple residents on that third floor where she was to go out into the hallway
That really stands out with me as well, because just a couple days earlier, there'd been the Civil War reenactment in the park behind the complex, something that's typically has hundreds of people. It is noisy. So they were used to hearing that kind of noise in a couple of days leading up to Jodi's disappearance. So what was it that got these people out of their sleep to go and look outside?
And if this witness has her nights right and everything else, and we have no reason to think she doesn't, but that makes it all the more frustrating a little bit that none of those concerned people who heard this unusual thing called the authorities, if that's what they were hearing.
I don't think that I necessarily would have called authorities. I think when we've heard about screams, that would have been a different kind of thing that might have prompted, you would hope, someone to call authorities, which they did not. But I think when you're sleeping, you hear something, you're not always sure what you heard. They're used to having noise. As she mentioned, she's used to that sort of thing. But clearly it took on a larger significance in her mind after seeing this young woman, Jodi Huisentruit, whom she knew was gone, and what had happened to her.
So all of the new information that we're presenting in the podcast anyway, in this episode, being the car that was parked in a different parking lot on the complex, the beer cans in the different parking lot, the beer cans that were seen by somebody else in Jodi's parking lot, it's hard to kind of put all those puzzle pieces together to make sense of their involvement. So obviously we have to keep in mind that some, all, or none of these things might be related to what happened to Jodi.
Exactly. What stands out for both of these women is there's certain things that have stayed with them over the years. For the woman we talked about earlier, she said that she's always wondered about that gray car that was parked behind her building. That bothers her 26 years later. The other woman can't forget those beer cans lined up. Could that have been somebody sitting there watching Jodi's apartment, watching Jodi, or not connected? But these are impressions that have stayed with them. These are impressions they said they shared with the police in the early days of the investigation, but it's with them to this day. And we don't know if there's a connection or just a coincidence.
The beer cans that we're seeing in Jodi's lot, I'm struck by, because if they were lined up, it sounds like on the curb stop in the parking lot. The witness mentions the dumpster's 50 feet away. I can tell you it's 50 feet, if that. And remember, Jodi's car was parked right by where those cans, I guess, were seen, and that's 12 feet away from the door. And Jodi's unit was very close to the door, albeit on the second floor, but right above that egress point. So if somebody were to be waiting or observing Jodi or stalking Jodi from that vantage point, that's very brazen, because it's right. I mean, Jodi could have looked out her window and easily seen the person.
Exactly. And you wonder if that person felt comfortable enough that he could have a cover story. Oh, I live here, I'm visiting somebody. What would his explanation have been if anybody asked him, what are you doing here? I guess one of the things one would hope is that the beer cans might have been collected. Whoever was taking Jodi's, a good chance that person had to wait longer than you might anticipate, because Jodi was running an hour late to go to work. So if somebody was waiting there for her, could they have been drinking beer? Could they have been smoking a cigarette? If so, were these items scooped up as they collected things in the parking lot? Were they retained potentially, if there's any potential evidence down the road? I know back in the early years in 2004, the lead investigator, Lieutenant Ron Vanderweerd, said they had very little physical evidence. Could it be this is something that would not have maybe fit into that category back then, but would have potential now if it's something that could be tested? We don't know. We do know that this information from these witnesses was available back then.
We just happen to be putting together this episode now, but this week, an appearance you made on the Murder Squad podcast with Paul Holes and Billy Jensen, a retired investigator, very prominent in recent years, especially with various cold cases, but particularly the Golden State Killer out in California, and Billy Jensen, renowned crime journalist. What were some of your observations of their take on this case that you've been covering for 20 years?
They seem to put have a lot of interest in the stalking element, things that we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. The fact that Jodi had reported a stalking incident, the fact that Jodi had taken a self-defense class just 2 months before she disappeared, the report of the phone calls that we obtained from the people who had golfed with Jodi, harassing type phone calls that Jodi mentioned, to the point that she said she told them she was going to get her phone number changed. They seem to put all these pieces together to say, at least take a strong look at the stalking element, was my takeaway. Paul Holes seemed particularly interested in the fact that Jodi's bed appeared made. And that's, again, to me, that maybe wasn't conveyed as well when we reported it. Maybe, in fact, it was the covers were pulled up. It wasn't like a perfectly made bed necessarily, but that seemed to really hit him as something out of the ordinary. The toilet seat's obviously something that would be on the radar. He seemed to be struck Paul holes by the fact that her complex seemed fairly kind of back, set away from things, not out there in the middle of a busy street where maybe there'd be a lot of people seeing what's going on.
I think it's a point Billy makes in the podcast. The initial search, they're talking about where you start looking for Jodi or clues in those first minutes and hours when the scene is still an active scene. And Billy points out, who can see, from where can they see Jodi's window?
Right.
And vice versa. And it's worth pointing out to the audience who might not be familiar with the location that Jodi's window during the summer months is less visible from the campground area because of the foliage. But you could still see it from there. You had an angle there. You can see it from parts of Building B, parts of Building A, and you can see her window from even a portion of the street on Kentucky Avenue if you're facing south. So it wasn't just the oval bowl of the parking lot that necessarily might have been the crime scene for police back in 1995. It could be anywhere within, line of sight of Jodi's apartment window.
Right. That was something that they did emphasize, that any of the spots potentially that a person would be hanging out, maybe as long as an hour or more, what was that person doing? Could that person have been sitting in a car with a cigarette hanging out the window? You have to look at all of that. It was interesting to get their take as some people who deal with these cases all the time from the outside looking in.
The complex itself and the people that live there, sort of a unique crime scene because it's public in one sense in that it's a busy parking lot. At least it's a parking lot a lot of people have access to, but it's private in the sense it's a residence. A unique crime scene, I've always thought, in Jodi's case. We're trying to establish as best we can an understanding of the people who lived in Jodi's building and the other two buildings and even down the street. How important do you think to this case knowing the complex and the geography and the people that live there is for us?
I think it's critical to know exactly where things happen. Much of the focus is on the Mazda Miata, the immediate area where Jodi was grabbed just 12th Street from the building. But what else is going on? Who else is coming and visiting people? We know that residents were interviewed, but could there be somebody else who was doing some work on the building, or somebody who was visiting a friend that came through that's not on anybody's radar, but who could have had a reason to maybe explain why they were in the parking lot if anybody confronted them? What are those factors that we don't know? Is the key complex? Is that parking lot a critical part of the case that still needs to be looked at and revisited? And that's why we're doing it. That's why we have tried to reach many of the people who were interviewed early on. Unfortunately, as you and I have found, too many of them have passed away. There's one woman across the hall, somebody in the other buildings, a person who reported a scream. He was in Building B that said it went on for up to 30 seconds. He was up in the middle of the night. He's sure it was about 4:30. He's passed away. So it's very frustrating going back to try to get people who remember. And that's why I'm grateful, particularly some of the people like these two women who still remember certain things very clearly. Because an incident like this stays with you. You may not remember a lot of other things in your life, but this was a key part of their lives, and they were both very affected by it. Two young women living in an apartment complex when Jodi was abducted.
FindJodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact FindJodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire FindJodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.